Hi guys, we're going to be talking about poetic sound today. We're going to be looking at the key terms and the vocabulary important in this content assessment. Overall, what you're going to be working on is you're going to be taking notes on this presentation. And with those notes, you should understand the definitions of each of the following terms, and you should be able to identify examples of each. The things we'll be talking about are meter, rhyme, sound devices, including alliteration, assonance, and consonants, enjambment, and repetition, and a specific type of repetition called anaphora. We're going to start off by talking about meter. Meter, and you should write this definition down, is the rhythmic pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a given line of verse. Really, when we're talking about meter, we're focusing on syllables. And when you're reading a poem for meter, you need to be paying attention to the number of syllables in each line. Even though it can be hard to kind of figure out the meter in some poems, what you're really looking for is the rhythm, how each of these words and each of these syllables create a pattern that is consistent throughout the whole poem. The reason we study this is that meter isn't something that just happens. Creating a pattern is intentional. It's a choice that an author makes. And that pattern often influences or creates specific effects that the reader can take away as they're reading. To figure out what the meter is, you're looking for two things. The first thing that you're looking for is the type of metrical foot that a poem uses. The second thing that you're looking at is the number of those feet in each line. That will help you understand the line length as well. A metrical foot is just a group of syllables that creates a sound pattern. The pattern is created through how the author puts stress or does not put stress on certain syllables, and it's also created by the number of syllables in that foot. An example that you might be familiar with is called iambic pentameter. It's a very common form of meter. Iambic as a word just refers to a type of foot used in a poem. If something is iambic, or if it has iambs, it means that that foot has two syllables in it, and those two syllables fall in an unstressed followed by a stressed syllable pattern. An example would be the word betray. The first thing I'm going to do to figure out the foot here is I'm going to look at how many syllables are in the word betray. I know that it can break down into two syllables, be and tray. When I read the word normally, betray, I notice that I am more forceful when I say the second syllable. It sounds more normal to say betray than it would to say betray, putting the emphasis on the first. So, knowing that betray is an unstressed and then a stressed syllabic pattern means that it's an iamb. Pentameter just refers to the number of feet in a line of poetry. Penta coming from 5, which means that in a line of poetry written in iambic pentameter, there are 5 feet, or 5 iambs, for a total of 10 syllables. You'll know that if something has 11 syllables in it, it is therefore not written in iambic pentameter, because it would have 1 syllable too many. To continue with this example of iambic pentameter, we're going to look at a line from from William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The first 2 lines of this play are "Two households both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our seat." The first thing we're going to do is just count the syllables in each line. We'll see that there are 10 syllables in each line, which means that it would have 5 feet. However, then we need to go back and figure out that unstressed, stressed pattern. What we know about it being iambic pentameter will help us. And then we try saying it out loud. So when you see an X, it will mean that it's an unstressed syllable. When you see a slash, it means that it's a stressed syllable. So if I were to really emphasize this unstressed, stressed pattern, it would sound like this. Two households both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. Nobody really reads like that. So what it would sound like normally is two households both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. When we think about meter, it's very subtle when we just read it out loud, but we can always go back and figure out where that emphasis lies. Some other examples of metrical terms that are nice to know, but you probably don't need to write down and memorize every single one of these terms, are words like iamb. That would be the name for a 2-syllable metrical foot following the unstressed stressed pattern. A 2-syllable metrical foot that kind of flips the iamb, that follows the stressed and then unstressed pattern, would be called a trochee. A dactyl is a 3-syllable metrical foot following a stressed, unstressed, unstressed pattern. Then we get into these terms of that show how many syllables are in each line of poetry. If you see dimeter, it would be a line of poetry with 2 feet. Trimeter, a line of poetry with 3 feet. Tetrameter is a line of poetry with 4 feet. Pentameter, like we talked about, is a line of poetry with 5 feet in it. So, for example, a poem that is written in dactyl tetrameter would have 12 total syllables. The reason I know that is that the metrical foot is 3 syllables. Saying that it's tetrameter means that there are 4 of those dactyls in the line of poetry. 4 times 3 would be 12 total syllables. Next up, we're going to talk about rhyme. Rhyme, at its most basic level, is the repetition of sounds at the end of a line of verse. An example of it would be, I have come to the borders of sleep, in the unfathomable deep forest where all must lose their way, however straight or winding soon or late, they cannot choose. That's from a poem called Lights Out by Edward Thomas. All of the words that are highlighted here, both sleep and deep, are highlighted in red. Those obviously rhyme. Lose rhymes with choose, both in orange, straight and late. In blue, also rhyme. One thing you might want to notice is that lose and choose, even though they are not lines of poetry that immediately follow one another, they still rhyme, and we still consider that an important thing to note. It's really important to be aware that when we're talking about rhyme, we're looking at how the words sound, not necessarily how they're spelled. So when we go back and look at this, we see these 2 words, straight and late. Those don't have the same spelling, but that 8 sound at the end makes them rhyme. Same with lose and choose. Lose and choose don't look the same necessarily, but when we read it out loud, we know that it's pronounced lose, and so we know that it rhymes with the ending sound in choose. At times, this can get a little funky, and the reasons it can get funky are that sometimes rhymes might be based on that spelling instead of sound. Really, the only time this happens is in very old text when pronunciation used to be different. So just because we don't say the words exactly the same now as we did in the 1500s, those 2 words that look like they rhyme should have rhymed then when they were pronounced a little bit differently. However, we also need to know that sometimes poets are just playing a little loose with those rules. When a poet plays a little bit loose like that, when they're putting together words that don't quite rhyme, we call it slant rhyme. So that means that words almost rhyme, but they're not perfectly rhyming. And that's okay, we still consider it rhyming. When we're looking at a rhyme scheme in a poem, what we're looking for is the pattern of different rhymes and the pattern of how words rhyme with each other. The process to figure that out is really straightforward, but you do just need to kind of notice what rhymes and what words rhyme throughout the poem. So to do that, as you read the poem, label each different sound at the end of a line with a letter. That you can start with A, you can work your way down the alphabet, or you can start with R. Nobody really cares. You'll see it starting with A most often. Every time you see a different sound at the end of a line, you give it a different letter. So when we're looking at our first example, you could say, instead of highlighting it in red, I have come to the borders of sleep. That sleep would be an A. That's our first letter of D. Then you would see the unfathomable deep. Deep also has the same ending as sleep. You also label it with an A. You'd see a forest where all must lose. That's a new sound, so it gets a B. Their way, however, straight. Again, a new sound, it gets a C. Or winding, soon or late. Same sound as the one before, so it also gets a C. Finally, they cannot choose, but that's going back to lose. It rhymes with B. So you can also take some time now and practice a little bit of how to determine the rhyme scheme. I'm going to read through the poem, and as I do on your paper, you're going to write down the rhyme scheme as you see it, just writing those A's, B's, C's, etc. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, O thou, who chariotest to their dark wintry bed, the winged seeds where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow. Her clarion o'er the dreaming earth and fill, driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odors plain and hill, wild spirit which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, hear, O hear. That's a poem called Ode to the West Wind by Percy Bysshe Shelley. So now you get to check yourself. The rhyme scheme should be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, C, D, E, D, E, E. This is a tricky one because there is some slant rhymes, including where we see the C, thou, low, and blow. Thou is a little bit different. Again, that's probably because Percy Bysshe Shelley was a much older writer. These words were probably pronounced a little bit differently. Same thing with air, where, and here. Here is slightly different sounding than the other two words. Doesn't mean it's not rhyming, it's just called slant rhyme. The next thing that we have to talk about are what we call sound devices. There are three main sound devices that we're going to talk about. All of these involve the repetition of different kinds of sounds in words close to each other. So that's pretty sequential words. The three things we're going to talk about and we're going to figure out the difference is between alliteration, assonance, and consonants. When we're talking about alliteration, we're specifically talking about the repetition of consonant sounds in the beginnings of words. So again, there are two things to know about alliteration. A, it's specifically with consonant sounds, and B, they only happen at the beginning of words. An example would be, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free, we were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. So here, we see fair, foam, flew, furrow, followed, free, first. All of these F sounds come pretty close to one another. We also see this repetition of the B sound, breeze and blew. One thing to note is we didn't highlight the B in burst because there's quite a bit of text that happens between this second B and the third. Likewise, we have these repeating S sounds in silent and C, so that we see that because they're right next to each other, that would count as alliteration. This is from a poem called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And as you can see, there are many words that start with the letters F, B, and S in this section. This is not the entire poem, this is only one small part of it. However, the difference between alliteration and assonance is that assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds within words that are close to one another in a poem. This is pretty much directly the opposite of alliteration, even though it sounds kind of the same. It's talking about vowel sounds as opposed to consonant sounds, and this is within words rather than at the beginning. An example of this would be, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where off the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. Again, that's Kubla Khan, also by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Here, we see that this A sound repeats in many of the words. This is not just any A sound. This is the ah sound of the A in Xanadu, Alf, ran, caverns. They're all the same length of A sounds. That's where we get this last note, where it's important to note that it's not just the use of the vowel, it's the specific sound that that vowel makes. So this would explain why stately, here the A or A stately, those A's are not highlighted. They are not considered part of the assonance because they're the longer A sounds. Finally, we get to consonants. Consonants is the repetition of consonant sounds within words that are close to one another in a poem. So it's similar to alliteration in that it's consonant sounds. However, it differs in that it's within words as opposed to at the beginning. An example of this would be, "O captain, my captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every wrack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes with the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring." It's from "O Captain, My Captain" by Walt Whitman. We have the repeating R sound throughout the stanza. So here in weathered, every, rack, prize. And we do have an R that happens at the beginning of the word here. It doesn't make it alliteration because the other R's happen within the words. So we know that it's consonants, not alliteration. When we have these sound devices, often we see them happening together, especially when we have the consonant sounds that happen at the beginning and within words and alliteration in consonants. In many cases, when the poet uses one, they're going to use a lot of those repeating sounds. So the reason we have sound devices is that not only do they help create the rhythm along with probably the meter of the poem, they link words. They say these words kind of go together, or you should pay attention to these sounds in groups. We do that because when we see that sound repeated over and over again, it makes our brains kind of listen to it extra, and so we pay extra attention to the words that include those similar sounds. The penultimate, or second to last, poetic sound device that we're going to talk about is called enjambment. Enjambment is the running over of a sentence or phrase from one poetic line to the next without terminal punctuation. Terminal punctuation is punctuation that happens at the end of a line or at the end of a phrase. A really extreme example of this is a poem by William Carlos Williams. "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens." When we read this whole poem, it's actually just all one complete sentence. And we read it that way. We read it like you would read it if it were written horizontally on just like one straight line across. It's important to know about enjambment because it affects the way that you read a poem. It would not make sense to read this poem, "So much depends upon a red wheel, barrow, glazed with rain, water, beside the white chickens." Because we don't have punctuation, we're not pausing anywhere between the lines. So when we see an enjambed line, just keep reading right on through. Another example of it is from a poem called Harlem by Langston Hughes. And it says, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" So the lines in red show examples of where Langston Hughes has used enjambment. See, "Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun?" That's all one sentence, or all one question. Alternatively, we see these other lines, including this one at the end, that include terminal punctuation, or punctuation at the end of the line. So that shows us that those lines should be read as whole phrases, whereas these lines in red that are enjambed, they go together in one phrase. That also helps us understand the meaning, because we're not just asking, does it dry up? When we analyze it, we don't focus just on this question of does it dry up. We go back and look at that image of does it dry up like a raisin in the sun. And that adds to what we can analyze when we're writing and looking for meaning. The last thing that we're going to talk about is repetition. A lot of poetry depends upon repetition to help make its point. The definition is pretty much what you would expect. It can be when sounds, words, phrases, lines, or whole stanzas are repeated within a single poem. For example, the chorus in a song would be an example of repetition. So that's kind of a stanza of a song that gets repeated multiple times when you're singing. There's one specific form of repetition that we are going to talk about, and that's called anaphora. Anaphora is a type of parallelism when a number of lines begin with the same word. So they're parallel in their structure in that they are all beginning in exactly the same way. An example of this can be seen in The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. It starts, after the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation, of thunder of spring over distant mountains, he who was living is now dead, we who are living are now dying with a little patience. So we see anaphora used in these first three lines that all begin with after the torchlight red, after the frosty silence, after the agony in stony places. Because that begins with the same phrase, it's an example of anaphora. Now, you should be an expert on poetic devices, and you should also have notes on the poetic sound terms, including meter, rhyme, alliteration, assonance and consonants, enjambment, and anaphora. If you feel like you've missed information on any one of those things, feel free to go back and review the slides or watch some of this presentation over again. That's all, and I hope you guys really enjoy reading and analyzing poetry with this new information.